Good day, everybody. This is Tibor Shanto, and I'll be hosting the webinar today, the Proactive Prospecting Dynamics of Successful Outbound Calling. Just in terms of housekeeping, there is an area where you can submit questions, so I'll be stopping periodically through this presentation, which will be fairly fast-paced, so feel free to throw in whatever questions you have, and then we'll also have a few minutes for Q&A at the end. So don't be shy. Nobody else knows who asked the questions, so you can even ask the silliest questions on the planet. I'm going to give it a half a more second before we get started, and then we'll jump right into it. So again, and I think there will be the opportunity to watch this on demand in case you have to check out early. So welcome again, and my name again is Tibor Shanto. To give you a sense, I am the head of a company in Toronto called Renbor. We focus primarily on new business acquisitions with B2B teams, so outbound calling, business development reps, sales development reps is part of our key focus. I'm also the co-author of an award-winning book on trigger event selling, and as you can see on your screen, a number of other recognitions from the industry. More importantly, these are the companies that I've had the privilege and opportunity to work with, and again, the one thing that they all have in common is a great focus on not just winning new business, but specifically competitive business. So today, again, we're going to talk about some of the dynamics around outbound calling and how even if you have the best message and the best crafted talk track, if you're not taking dynamics into account, then you're likely to be much less successful when it comes to prospecting by telephone, and as a result, I would argue, much less successful when it comes to selling because of a lack of prospects. So let's take a look at the dynamics, or at least the world of outbound calling these days. This outbound, inbound stuff wasn't such a distinction a few years back, but since the introduction of social selling and social media in general, certainly the landscape has changed, and I would argue for the better, especially as you combine some of the newer opportunities with some of the traditional approaches, as we will be in this presentation. But if we look at social media from a B2B perspective, clearly the big mothership of all B2B sales platforms is LinkedIn, but you can also go to some commercial sources for leads. You can use email individually or on a mass basis. You can use referrals. I would encourage you to use text. If somebody has their cell phone number or mobile number on their business card, there's nothing that states that you have to do it strictly as a device to transmit your voice. You can also transmit text and make it succinct and specific to the individual. And there's always snail mail. And again, think about when the last time you got a handwritten note from somebody. So one of the ways to stand out these days is to actually include snail mail, as you'll be seeing later in your prospecting cadence. But there's no getting away from the fact that the proverbial favorite and still one of the most effective tools, especially if you're doing outbound calling instead of sitting around and waiting for inbound, is the telephone. And this is not lost on even the most modern social sellers. Just witnessed this, which was an ad for LinkedIn. They were looking for a sales rep up here in Toronto to sell their social selling platform. And even LinkedIn, the home of the social selling index, you should check what your social selling index is on LinkedIn. But notice what the number one responsibility for this sales rep is, which is cold calling prospects. So while we see a lot of things out there saying that, LinkedIn killed cold calling, I think they just want to keep it to themselves because it works. So today we're going to focus, as I mentioned, on the dynamics of direct prospecting, how you manage the delivery, the message, and then obviously the execution. And one of the things I do want to mention, and I'll keep coming back to throughout, and I want you to think about as you're making your outbound calls, is content is important, but it's not the end-all and be-all. As I mentioned earlier in the introduction, if your message doesn't land the way that you need it to land, if the person is not taking in the complete message, if there are things interfering with what you're trying to communicate and what they're receiving, then you're not going to be as effective. And in fact, in some instances, you're actually going to be further behind. So we're going to put a great deal of focus on dynamics. And dynamics are a relatively basic thing, but we don't think about it. And as a result of that, we don't do as good a job of managing it. The first thing to consider when it comes to dynamics is that what we're doing when we're making outbound calls, and I'm assuming that you're calling somebody who fits the profile of a good customer, so you've done all your research and you've taken it as far as you can without connecting with the person directly, but they do fit into your profile. They look like your best customers. But the only thing is that you don't have a call scheduled with them that day. So given that reality, what we practice when we're making outbound calls, and there's nothing wrong with it, but let's call it what it is disruptive marketing. The reality is most individuals that you're going to be calling in a business environment today are probably trying to pack 16 hours of work into a 10-hour day, because every time that we hear about those layoffs at different companies, it's the people that get laid off. The amount of work doesn't get reduced in many ways, so it's the people who are left behind who need to deal with that excess or new work that was done by a former colleague last week. So again, the more that we hear about these layoffs and other things, the more that 16 hours being packed into a 10-hour day is going to grow. The effect of that is when we call these people unanticipated, unscheduled, unplanned, in the middle of their day or in the morning, or if you like to make your calls in the afternoon, we're effectively T-boning their day. And I want you to be comfortable in the fact that no prospects were hurt in taking this picture. But the reality is that's exactly what we're doing to their day, and their reaction is likely to be similar to that driver that's being hit unless you manage that dynamics, and we'll talk about objection handling further on in the presentation. But if you're not taking this into account and you're really enamored by your message and, marketing has convinced you that this is the best value proposition out there, and you don't take the fact that you're about to T-bone their day into account, then I'm going to argue that your call is not going to be nearly as effective as you would hope that it would be. The other thing to consider is when you're using the telephone, you don't have the benefit of body language. And, depending who you read, anywhere from 60 to 65% of effective communication comes down to body language. So often we can make small mistakes when we're there in person because the other person can see our body language. They could see the context of what we're saying and how we're saying it. On the telephone, we don't have that. We only have the benefit of intonation and the words that we use. As a result of that, we have to put a greater emphasis on the telephone, on the intonation, on the words that we use. Now, you can still use body language to your advantage in as much as it'll dictate your posture, which will dictate how you sound to the person at the other end of the phone. So one practice that I do recommend to people is that you actually use a mirror in front of yourself when you're making the call so you can have a conversation with that person in the mirror. In fact, I know of one individual down in the States who's a professional appointment setter, and she has a full-length mirror by her desk, and she stands in front of the mirror with her headset on, and she's very expressive because she's having that discussion with the person at the in the mirror, and as a result of that, that expressiveness, that calmness, because you're much more relaxed when you're talking to somebody as opposed to talking nervously into a phone, to somebody that you haven't spoken to and whose days you've just interrupted. So she uses that mirror to create more of a conversational tone. So consider that because, again, you need to make up for the lack of body language, but you can still use your posture and body movements to be that much more effective on the telephone. All that said, you're still going to be facing a basic challenge, and we don't have the benefit of being able to communicate directly at the moment, but feel free to throw in an answer into the question box when I ask. If you think about your typical buyer, if you think about the target of your outbound calls, whether you're calling for appointments or other reasons, but you've not spoken to this person before, you're not scheduled, think about that individual, and let's say they're a director of IT. How many different calls are they getting from unsolicited sources through the course of the day? So don't just think about what you sell. So if you sell software, there's you, there's other software, there is hardware people, there's network people. Think for a moment, on an average day, how many unsolicited calls that individual gets. I'll wait a second to see if anybody puts a number in there. If not, then you'll be stuck with mine. So generally when I ask this question, people will say anywhere from 10 to 20 calls. So what I want to do is go to the low end of that. And let's for a moment assume that that person is getting roughly 5 unsolicited calls a day. So that means me and 4 other people. A great possibility. Now, if that individual works 48 weeks in a year, because everybody's entitled to vacations and days off, that means that they're getting 1,200 calls over the course of the year. Now, if they've been in that position for the last 5 years, even if it's with different companies, but let's say they've been doing that exact same thing and continuing to get that 5 calls a day for 5 years, that means that over the course of 5 years, they will have received 6,000 calls of the nature that we're making over that time. So the real big question comes down to, how are you going to sound different? And what I find interesting is you can probably take 10 calls and listen to them, and there's almost an effort not to sound different. Same type of words, same type of expressions. You know, there's these fashionable jargons that come in and out of various sectors. And so how you're going to sound different is going to come down to a question of both the dynamics that we talked about, and we'll revisit again in a couple of minutes, as well as the content. And if you don't strive for that difference, then you're going to suffer the same fate as the 6,000 people who came before you who tried to call this individual. So let's transition to the content. And obviously, when you talk about sales, one of the most common things that salespeople use to describe what they sell and all that involves the word value. But what I've come to learn is that value is rarely defined. It's one of those words that's nudge, nudge, wink, wink. It's used by everybody. And, you know, I do this on a regular basis. I'll ask 5 salespeople to give me a definition of value, and what I end up with is 7 different definitions, because the first 2 will change their mind based on what the next 3 say. So even though I've only got 5 people, I've got 7 different definitions. It's hard to sell when the goalpost is moving. So I think others in sales figured that out earlier than me, so they came up with the next best thing that they thought about, which is a value proposition, which I guess is somewhat of a step up from an elevator pitch, which is very generic, or from a unique selling proposition, which really just talks about why you're different, not why you should be important to the buyer based on their priorities. But if you look at the way that they define proposition, there's still an element of me offering, pushing, or cajoling something onto the prospect. So my view is that, you know, you can put lipstick on it, but it's still a pitch. So what we want to do is get away from pitching. So what we do with our clients is we work around what we call an actionable definition of value. And it's quite simple, which is, I think, one of the reasons that it works well. And we define it as any offering that you have, whether it's hardware, software, services, whatever the case might be, whatever offering that you have that helps remove barriers or helps the client or prospect overcome hurdles or obstacles that are in their way, or if you can remove gaps between where the customer is and where their objectives are. So visually, it would look something like this. So you have the buyer on one side, and you have their objectives on the other side, and whatever thing that you can do to move them closer to those objectives, they're going to perceive as being valuable. So you don't have to take them all the way there in one fell swoop. What you have to demonstrate is that you have the means of advancing them towards their objectives. Funny aside, I just noticed that this morning when I was doing the final touches, this buyer looks awfully lot like your Paul Ryan, your head of this majority in the House. But again, maybe he has different objectives, who knows. So the other thing that comes into it, both from a dynamic perspective and the way that you communicate value, is which segment of the market are you trying to sell to? And broadly speaking, there are 3 general segments to the market. There is that 10% that's actively looking. These are the people who are coming to your website. These are the people who are downloading all those wonderful thought leadership white papers and other things that you have for download on your website. Keep in mind they're probably doing it with 4 or 5 other vendors as well. This is that group that's probably gone more than 2/3 of the way through their buying journey before they engage with a salesperson. So I would argue there's a couple of opportunities there. There's an opportunity to accelerate the cycle because you've got a willing partner in the process. But you should also make sure that you're not being price shopped or compared to others, that they're not using you to already validate or rationalize the decision that they've already made. But again, this 10% is there. They're actively looking. They're ready to buy. Price might be an issue. Some other concessions might be an issue, so you still have to sell them. But they've come to this point on their own. There's about another 20% that is what I call passively looking. So these are people who need to make a purchase decision, but they have the luxury of being able to defer that decision, 9 to 18 months down the road. So they may know that a lease on a piece of equipment may be coming up, or they know that they're just got engaged with a new client who is going to give them more orders than their current capacity can handle, so they're going to need to ramp up for that. But again, they have the luxury of time, and last time they bought a similar type of machine, it maybe took them 9 months to buy, so they're going to get actively engaged within about that 9-month time frame. Anything before that, they're approachable. I think that it's somebody you should spend time with because they're going to be making a purchase, and you have a long runway to become their go-to or their emotional favorite. But that leaves 70% of the market, the remainder of the market, in what is commonly known as status quo, right? And there are common descriptions for the status quo. They're happy, they're not looking, generally conceded that their sales rep's biggest competitor, complacency, is the biggest thing to move over. And there is this notion that they're averse to change, and, generally they're labeled as being satisfied. And a lot of the pundits will tell you that if they're satisfied, they're not going to do anything. And in fact, in the book that I co-wrote, there's an argument that's being made, which I don't think is any longer valid, that somebody needs to be in the window of dissatisfaction before they're ready to make a purchase. And the reason I say it's not totally valid is a few years ago I was doing some research on the states of the market, and it did split them into these actively looking buyers as well as the status quo. But one of the stats that I came across was in a book by Bell and Patterson called Customer Loyalty. And the reason I was looking at that is I wanted to see if we can identify what specifics keep a customer loyal, and we can infuse that into how we sell our next customer, then perhaps we can leverage the same elements that make a customer loyal to actually get a customer to switch. And the stats that they quoted were quite revealing. They showed that 75% of customers who switch from one vendor to a competitor, so they go from Verizon to AT&T, said that when they switched, at the time that they switched, they were either satisfied or completely satisfied when they left one vendor for the other. So it sort of pokes a hole in this need to be dissatisfied before a customer will move from one vendor to another. So I then started talking to my customers and others and try to understand what is it that was in play. What did these salespeople say that convinced these satisfied customers, completely satisfied customers, to abandon their current vendor and pick up camp and go to somebody else? And after some time, I came to the conclusion that there is one thing that all buyers in the marketplace have, whether they're actively looking, whether they're passively looking, or they're in the status quo. And I'll give you a second to think about it and put in the answer box what you think that one thing that all buyers, whether they're in pain and looking, or whether they're passively looking, or whether they're status quo, what do all buyers have in common? I'll give that a second, and I'll spare you the Jeopardy music. So the thing that they have in common is objectives. All business people, all businesses have objectives. If you sit down with them and ask them where they plan to be 12 months from now, 18 months from now, 24 months from now, etc., they have objectives. Now, again, if a company is in pain, if they're bleeding, cash flow, whatever the case might be, the immediate objective is to solve that pain. But once that pain is solved, they have several objectives behind that. So what became evident to me, and again in speaking and validating it with customers, is that the old perception that, the status quo is happy and not looking and close to alternatives is probably wrong. What it is that they've yet to be presented with what they perceive to be a means of achieving their objectives. So the problem is that many salespeople, when they go into a prospecting call, will rely on the same talk track that they use for the actively or passively looking customers, they'll use the same talk track with the status quo, and most of those introductory statements introduce the company and go automatically to a pain or a need. The status quo doesn't recognize that they have a pain or a need, and as a result of that, a lot of that messaging falls on deaf ears. And that's where, again, you need to bring dynamics into it. So if we can focus on objectives and what were the objectives that we helped our best customers achieve, and if these prospects resemble those customers, at least from a profile point of view, then the messaging around objectives should be more traction, and in fact has more traction than strictly looking at pains, needs, problems, or solutions. So what are some of the elements or some of the building blocks of objectives? So there's obviously risk avoidance. As a species, we tend to want to avoid risk. We'll probably take on, unnecessary things, to just avoid a little bit of risk. And if you want to witness that, spend a couple of minutes by the rental car counter at any airport and watch people buy insurance when they really don't need it for anything at the time. There's a whole bunch of things that you can do with risk that we don't have time to get into here, but think of it this way, that if people are risk averse, then perhaps it's more effective to raise the risk profile of where they are than to try and minimize the risk profile of where you are, because if their tendency is to move away from risk, the more risk you can build around where they are, the more likely it is that they're going to abandon that and move to an alternative, and that alternative hopefully is you. The financial is fairly obvious, but I would challenge you to think beyond that. So it's not just about saving money or increasing revenue. It's what are some of the other financial elements that you can impact. So can you help them, for instance, shift the cost structure of the way that they're financing projects, which won't impact price, but it may impact how they use their line of credit, and any savings and interest is going to be a financial plus as well. So don't limit your thinking two-dimensionally to strictly, can I make you more money or can I save you money? Think about some of the domino and knock-on effects that have a financial impact on the company. Productivity is one of these empty calorie words that a lot of salespeople use, and what I mean by empty calorie is that they've lost, because it's so overused, everybody uses it. Like, remember a few years ago, everybody and their sister was talking about synergy. So if you don't qualify productivity, then I'm going to argue that they're going to interpret it the same way they've interpreted it the last 5,999 times that they've gotten the call. So if you're going to say productivity, give an example of that and what the impact on the customer's business was. So as a result of outsourcing something to you, they were able to redeploy resources to their core product, and as a result of that, they were able to increase margins by 3%, capture more market share, whatever the case might be. But quantify, give it an extra sentence. If you're going to say something about productivity, talk about what that productivity step was and what the outcome as a result of that was. And it's relatively easy to do in a prospecting call. Time shifting is easy. Time is the same for everybody, as you'll see in a couple of minutes, but at the same time, you hear expressions like time stands still, time flies when you're having fun. So if you can shift time in their favor, if you can help them get to market quicker, if you can extend the life of an asset, anything along those lines that's going to shift time in their favor, aligning that with specific objectives, is just going to propel that much better. And then there's role-based interest. A marketing VP is going to look at the same thing entirely differently than the CIO, and entirely different again from the CFO. So you need to make sure that those particular objectives are also brought into it, and in light of the fact that there are multiple buyers in most purchases these days, and if you listen to some of the things in the CEB's Challenger Customer, there's about 5.4 stakeholders in any given decision, so you need to be cognizant of the role-based interest. We then take that into a grid, and you could do this either physically like this, or you can do it in your CRM, or you can do it any format you like. But notice that the approach we want to take is identify which of the objectives we're going to impact, and then have 3 business impacts at the ready. So rather than being abstract and talking about this, that, or the other, forget the product, talk about what the impact for your customers has been. So have you been able to reduce their risk? Have you been able to change positively the financial profile? Have you been able to automate something that they were doing manually before? And then talk about the advantage of you doing that for them. but you're going to capture a lot more people if you can talk about how you've impacted similar objectives than focusing on the fact that you're a Fortune 500 company. Very impressive, but not relevant to any prospecting call. So you'll notice that in the layout, it looks very much like our friend Ryan there when he's not being the Speaker of the House and playing a model in my value graph here. But again, as you can see, it lines up with that because you can align with the buyer's objectives by giving them specific impacts that you can bring to those objectives. And then let's talk about prospecting itself in terms of why it is that most people don't like to prospect. And the number one reason is fear of rejection. 99 out of 100 people will tell you that. So the key is that rejection is part of the overall process. And there's too many salespeople and too many sales programs trying to figure out ways to avoid objections. You're not going to be able to avoid the objection because you just T-boned their day. They got 16 hours back into a 10-hour day, and you're just trying to disturb that. So the real secret to having success with objections is not trying to figure out how to avoid them, but actually working with them, anticipating them, being ready for when they come, and then leveraging them to change that interruption into a conversation and then ultimately into engagement. Now, I need to be perfectly honest. There is one foolproof way to avoid rejections, and it works every time. It's bulletproof, but it does come with side effects. So like those medical commercials on the evening news, you need to know that the best way to avoid rejection is to not make the call. Unfortunately, that comes with a number of side effects that you don't want to go to. But it's still the method of choice for a lot of salespeople. So again, forget avoiding things, make the call, be ready for the objection, and then be ready to handle it. Now, in terms of rejection, here's a couple of interesting stats that from various sources it's been shown that a sales qualified lead, so that's something that either you generated a lead on your own or marketing has vetted the lead. So think of it as initial handshake, whether it's virtual or direct, to actual close. The average close ratio across all B2B, so don't look at your industry alone, but B2B, is about 16.4%, so roughly an 83.5% rejection rate. Most people who take a prospecting program, whether it's mine or a number of other good ones that are out there, I'd prefer if you take mine, but let's acknowledge the fact that there's some other good ones out there, their success rate is about 14% from contact to conversion to an actual opportunity. So, the people that you speak to, 14% will take an appointment of some form. So my question to you is, what's the big difference between being rejected 83.5% of the time and 86% of the time on the other hand? I don't see that 2.5% as being different. But I think the reason is that there's generally a lack of process for what happens before that engagement. So most salespeople, most organizations have some form of roadmap or process for what happens once that lead is engaged, right? So there's initial stage, what are the activities, what do you do, what are you trying to get out? Same thing for the second stage, clear delineators. So by the time you get to the end of the process, even if you lose, you know that you've done everything that you can and should to win the deal. So there's some way to contextualize it, or if you will, even rationalize it. So let's look at some of the things that impact the process beforehand. So one of the things is metrics. And most salespeople don't know their metrics. They'll know their favorite athlete's number for a $5 bet, but they don't know their own numbers. So we're looking for simple things. If you need to get one sale, then how many real proposals do you need to generate? So if you need 2, then the next question is to generate a real proposal. And by real, I mean that it has a chance of actually closing. How many prospects are you going to have to be engaged with? How many sales cycles will you need to go on at a time? So let's say you need a 2 for every proposal. And then the question is, how many people do you need to go and see, and how many leads do you need in order to cover that number of appointments? So if these are your conversion rates, then the next question becomes, if you needed 3 sales in a given month, then how many proposals are you going to need to generate? How many real prospects are you going to have engaged in a discovery process with you? And then ultimately, how many initial engagements are you going to need to have? And once you have these metrics, you can then begin to utilize your time more effectively. You can begin to focus on which areas of skill do you want to improve, because next year your quota is going to be higher, so there's going to have to be improvement somewhere. But without knowing your metrics, you're not in a position to improve your game. And metrics are not about having measurement by the organization. It's very much like the stats that an athlete has, that they're not going to know what to improve unless they begin to measure what they're doing. And then the other, as I mentioned, is time. So, time is the great equalizer. I've never had a salesperson tell me that they've run out of skills, but they always tell me that they run out of time. So we get salespeople to look at time in a very tangible and physical way. So the average salesperson in North America has roughly about 1,760 hours in a given year. That's 200 days, 8 hours a day that are potentially face time with customers. So if you think about that as being something tangible, if you think about it as being cash, and you took it to your local wealth manager, what would that look like? And it gets us to think about time in a very simple way, and that is there's only two things you can do with it. You can use it or you can waste it. And I would encourage you to track your activities for a day and see how much time you could recover and reinvest in your success. Now, I'm sure somebody who's listening in has taken a time management program, so I want to apologize in advance when I say that time management has got to be one of the stupidest concepts ever inflicted on salespeople, because time already comes managed. We all agree that 60 minutes to an hour, 24 hours to a day, 7 days to a week, 12 months to a year. Even Hillary and Donald can agree on that much. So you can't really manage time per se, but what you can do with time is you can allocate it and then manage your activities within the time that you've allocated. So I mentioned before about the wealth manager. When you take $1,760 to your local investment manager, the first thing he's going to do is understand what your requirements are, what are the things that have to be in place, what are some of the things that are discretionary, and in a sense, they'll allocate your money towards different investments, whether that's stock, debt, derivatives, whatever the case might be. You need to do the same thing with your activities. So think about allocating time to your key activities. So ask yourself, what are the high-value activities that as a salesperson you need to execute over the course of a cycle, not on a day-to-day basis, but let's say your sales cycle is 12 weeks. What are the things that you have to do to consistently win? So prospecting is one, I would imagine. Once you've prospected them, you have to sell them. Once you've sold them, you have to manage those accounts. We all have admin to a degree. We need to do prep and research, need to have time for planning. In my case, I need to have time to do these sort of webinars or the training itself. And all these things cut into my assets, as it were, if you think of your time as being an asset. And as a result of that, how you carve that up will help you align with your metrics and will help you look for and create improvement over time. So you'll constantly be in control of your time, in control of your success, and I would argue much better prepared to prospect, because if you don't do this exercise, then all these things will begin to pile up, and generally when things pile up, we stop doing the things that we like to do least, which in most salespeople's case is prospecting. And then, of course, it has to translate into your calendar, which most salespeople don't do on a very good basis. They only put client meetings into their calendar. But it's those petty activities that we have to do on a day-to-day basis that need to be covered. And then the last thing you should avoid is multitasking. Multitasking is just an opportunity not to get a whole bunch of things done, because we're not built as a species to do that. But if you allocate your time and manage your activities, then you're going to minimize the requirement to do multitasking. And then, again, the way that you would do this is you would initiate the call, then you would make your engage statement, you get ready for the objection, and then you need to take away that objection. And this is, again, where dynamics and content come into it. So here's an example of an introductory statement that I do. Again, not many people know me outside of my circles, so I use some companies that I've dealt with as a halo effect and a validation. And notice nowhere in my introduction do I talk about what I do or who I am or anything like that. I talk about the outcomes and the impacts that we've been able to deliver to clients based on their specific role. So if we go back to our grid, again, what you'll see is that pipeline activity goes to productivity. Shortening the sales cycle, I'm shifting time in their favor, and the accuracy of the forecast is something that most VPs of sales or directors of sales are very focused on. So again, I lead with the impacts, then we get to what I bring to the table, and it's all aligned around the objectives of the particular customer that I tend to follow, which is heads of sales. Now, in terms of objections, and they are going to come, the good news is that 80% of the time, 80% of people will go to one of the 5 most common objections that I'll share in a minute. So if you're ready for those objections, then you're going to be in a much better position to take away that objection and refocus or reframe the discussion around a particular mutual area of interest, which again will be based on their objectives. Again, the 5 biggies that happen when you're doing disruptive marketing are status quo. They're all set. They're good. They don't need anything. They're happy. There's no interest for various reasons. Don't have any time right now. They don't have any time in the next 6 months. In fact, usually they don't seem to have time till the second coming. And then finally, there's bad experience, and they want you to send them some stuff. So if you're ready for these 5, you've covered about 80% of the potential objections that you're going to get. We don't have time to get into the specifics, but I'll give you the general formula and then an opportunity to download the objection handling handbook. But think about it as being a series of conditioned response on the parts of the buyer. You know, think of yourself when you go into a department store with your significant other. You're in the middle of a conversation, and a very nice clerk very professionally comes up to you and says, "May I help you?" And I'm betting you, like 90% of the population, will say, "I'm just looking," and off you go. And about 5 minutes later, you're complaining to the other person, "This place has no service, even though somebody offered to help you 5 minutes ago." So if we roll things back and we go to the same store, same conversation, same door, same entry, same clerk comes up to us and says, "May I help you?" And we say, "We're just looking." But this time the clerk says, "Well, perhaps if you tell me what you're looking for, I could show you where it is." More of us are likely to engage. Not everybody, but more of us are likely to engage. And if that person continues that means of dialogue, we're probably going to end up spending more than we wanted to. And that's the outlook I want you to take to objections over the telephone, is that, A, they have very little to do with you, but more with the circumstance and the 5,999 calls that came before you. The other is, what can you do to change the dynamic from the customer's point of view so they're more likely to engage and you don't sound like those other 5,999 that came before you? The formula is fairly straightforward. We need to acknowledge what they say, have a statement ready, again, based on impacts that we've been able to address for clients that will give us credibility, that at the same time involve them, and then finally a call to action. You can go to this site and download the Objection Handling Handbook for free. Normally, I think it sells for about $12.97. It'll take you through not only the 5 most common objections, but some of the others that come up on a regular basis, in some ways to structure a talk track that will help you avoid certain objections that are common to your particular field. And the last thing that I want to touch on is voicemail. It's not going away. So I'll share with you a methodology that gets me about 40 to 50% of messages returned within about 72 hours. And the first thing to remember is that everything you do in a sales cycle has a purpose. And most people abuse the purpose of voicemail because what they try and do is sell or engage or actually close right from the voicemail itself. And what I want to get you to buy into is that the only measure of success when it comes to voicemail is getting a call back. So if you can get a call back, then you can go into your introductory statement, list your impacts, and then ask for the appointment. But trying to get an appointment or a sale over the phone when usually you do your best selling direct is just going to waste your time. And if you think about it, as a result of that, your message has to be different. In fact, it has to be counterintuitive. So most outbound messages, if we were to phone some people now and we'd listen to their voicemail, it would probably sound like, "Please leave a detailed message." And if you ask yourself why they want a detailed message, primarily it's because they want to know why it is that they don't have to call you back. So the idea is to really have a voicemail message that allows you to cut the message off somewhere after the initiate, create that level of mystery or intrigue that will get them to give you a call back. And the way that that's done, is to basically call, leave your name and number, and then leave a third-party reference of somebody that they could recognize. Fortunately, there's a slide here missing with a URL, so if you want to send me an email, I'll send you a URL to a series of videos on voicemail. But the last thing we'll touch on is persistence. I think most salespeople tend to give up way too soon, as some of these stats suggest. And I'm going to encourage you to come up with a plan that will put you in a position to touch the prospect 8 times over the course of 2 weeks. Because unless you're that persistent, they have too many other things on their to-do list. So simple formula that a lot of the people I work with use: start with a voicemail on Monday. Wednesday, give them a voicemail again. If they don't call you back by the end of the day, send them an email. The email will state that I'm going to call you tomorrow at 11. I don't expect them to be at their desk at 11 the next day, but I do get a chance to leave a message at 11 and suggest that I do actually follow through on what I say. I'll also put a snail mail out there for the reasons I stated earlier. Give them the weekend off to relax. Monday, I might go with a LinkedIn connection. As I mentioned earlier, text is fair game. And then finally, at the end of the cycle, I will give them an end call, meaning that I'll let them know that this cycle is finished, but I will be calling them back in the future, because leads are quite recyclable. Unlike Glengarry Glen Ross, you can recycle them on an ongoing basis. So again, there's the URL for the Objection Handling Handbook. I'll leave that up there for a minute. I'll take questions in addition to the ones that are already there, but I think most of those have been addressed. Any questions? Any answers? Okay, well, again, if you do have any questions, feel free to email me or give me a shout. Again, I'll leave this URL up there for a couple of more seconds. But if you have any questions, any comments, feedback, always appreciated. Otherwise, continued success on your outbound calling. Thank you.